I recently did a road trip in Australia from Brisbane down to Melbourne. I went through a bunch of towns and cities including Byron Bay, Sydney, the Blue Mountains area, and Canberra. This was my first time driving on the right side of the road. Before then, I had only driven on American side roads, on the right side of the road. I was pretty nervous about renting a car, driving on the other side of the road, and doing a 2-week road trip by myself for the first time. I couldn't find any seriously helpful tips or techniques on YouTube, so I decided to keep note of things I noticed and make this video. I also think these tips work in reverse for Australians driving in America, but let's get started. I landed in Brisbane around 6 p.m. and I got to my car around 7 p.m. It was nighttime by then, and to be honest, I was really disoriented from the flight and everything. And when I got to the car, I opened the right side door, and it was honestly just strange to see the steering wheel and driver's seat on that side. So it took me about 30 seconds to actually understand what I was seeing. And this might have been just me getting in late, I think I was flying like 20 hours that day. But I think it is just strange to be looking at a car in that kind of a way, for the first time. So getting in the car for the first time is definitely strange. And driving out of the lot, I was very uncomfortable. But I only had a short drive to the hotel and then I spent the night there. So that was actually pretty good because it kept the amount of driving on the first day to a minimum. Something I noticed right off the bat, though, was that the seatbelt pressure is different. So when you sit on the left side of the car in America, on the driver's side seat, your seatbelt comes over your left shoulder and down to your right hip. In Australia, it's on the opposite side. The seatbelt comes over your right shoulder and down to your left hip. Now, that difference in pressure is not really inhibiting in any way, doesn't affect your driving, but it is uncomfortable and something I had to get used to over time, especially on long trips. I also had to get used to reaching on the opposite side for the seatbelt. Because it's coming from the opposite shoulder, I often reached, because of muscle memory, towards the middle of the car, right down the center aisle rather than towards the door. And this also wasn't a big deal because you're parked when you're doing that, and it was just kind of funny when I caught myself. The next point is pretty important. When you're driving on the left side of the road, on the Australian side, all highway or freeway exits will be on your left. So if you're driving in the leftmost lanes, which are the exit lanes in Australia, you need to keep right to stay on the road, to keep on going. Now this sounds obvious, but my muscle memory would often tell me that I was making a mistake when I wouldn't keep to the left when I wanted to stay on the road. Because in America, that's what you do if you want to stay on the freeway. My default instinct would say that I was actually exiting the street when I was actually doing what I needed to do to stay on it. So be careful of this, and if you do end up making a mistake and exiting the road on accident, try not to overcorrect or swerve back onto the street. Just be safe and just take the exit, and you can always get back on the highway another way. I actually found a bunch of interesting restaurants and explored a couple of small towns like this because I made the wrong turn and ended up somewhere I didn't mean to. It actually made things kind of fun. Fourth, the turn signal and wipers are on the opposite sides. You get used to this pretty quickly because you're using your turn signals often. But even still, I would sometimes end up flipping on my wipers when I wanted to signal to make a turn or make a merge. This can sometimes be surprising, but it's nice to have a heads up that this might happen occasionally, and everyone makes this mistake. And it's much better to expect it than be surprised on the road when suddenly you have these things moving in front of your windshield, and that's a lot to deal with when you're in Australia. The brake and accelerator are on the same sides of the driver's seat, as well as in the same order. So luckily you don't have to worry about that. It's exactly the same as in America. You still use your right foot to touch the brake and the accelerator. I was worried that they would be switched, but it is the same in the US. I'm surprised there wasn't more information about that. And I think that's a concern you might have, but you don't have to worry about it. Driving straight in Australia is a piece of cake. If you've got any decent experience behind the wheel, basically you just keep it still and, watch the lanes and everything. It's turning that things get a little bit more complicated. Right off the bat, right-hand turns are easier than left-hand turns. Because you'll be sitting on the right side of the car, you can easily see how much space you have there, right? Because you've got the window right next to you on your right side. And that makes it easier to judge how much room you need to give or what curve you need to make the turn. You can follow the lane line a little bit easier on that side. However, left-hand turns are a pain. You aren't going to be used to having that much car on that side of you. That much physical stuff to compensate for on that side. So now your brain has to make up for the majority of the car being on your left side rather than your right. Because in America, you sit on the left side and the majority of your car is on the right side. So making a left-hand turn in Australia takes some getting used to because of that. And so it's good to err on the side of caution and give things a good amount of space and take things at a reasonable speed. And you know what? In a couple days, you'll get used to it, and it's not that big of a deal. One tip I did read when prepping for my road trip was the acronym LARD, or Left Alive, Right Dead. This applies to most parts of the driving experience, but particularly if you're driving onto a road, especially if it's an unmarked two-way road. Always merge into the left lane. Your instinct will sometimes be to merge into the right, especially early on, but that will put you against the flow of traffic. Stay to the left. It's sometimes good to verbally remind yourself because it keeps it in your brain and it keeps you from making mistakes. And this also applies especially to roundabouts. Australia has a lot more roundabouts than America does, and it has them much more than four-way stops. I personally love roundabouts, and I think this is something we should have more in America, but that's a side point. So we don't have too many roundabouts in America, depending on where you are. And dealing with roundabouts is a particular driving scenario you'll have to get used to. Making sure to obey the laws of who goes first and the proper way to merge onto a roundabout. There are videos on that on YouTube, so I'm not going to get into it right now, but that is something you should be aware of going into it. Just remember, stay to the left and you'll be fine. It was always strange to get in the car and start driving. Getting in the seat and putting on the ignition and starting to go, releasing the brake, it was kind of always weird right off the bat. And that weirdness decreased over the road trip when I got used to driving on the opposite side, but I'd always be a bit nervous of the first 3 or 5 minutes in the car, whether it was at the beginning of the day when I was just getting started, or after taking a break from driving, getting gas, getting lunch, whatever it is. And that uneasiness goes away the more you drive. That time decreases where you're anxious about, just getting started. But it's important to be aware that you'll likely make more mistakes when you first get in the car, rather than 30 minutes or after an hour of driving. You might be more prone to making mistakes after like 2 or 3 hours of driving, but that's true for wherever you are. Now, I think that because you're basically restarting the car every single time, right? Every time you get back into the car, your mind and body they fall back into the America defaults more often, especially early on in the time that you're not driving. And so it takes a few turns and it takes a couple minutes to recalibrate to the Australian system every time you got back in the car. By the time I'd gotten down to Melbourne, I was totally over this. And actually, by the time I got down to Canberra, I was also pretty ready to get started in the car as soon as I got in. Now, the next point is pretty subtle, but I think it's probably the most important in my eyes. In America, you sit on the left side of the car and drive on the right side. As a result, your eyes tend to use the left lane line as a measure of where you are in the lane. Because you're sitting on the left side of the car, you keep yourself closer to the left lane line to make sure the car is appropriately situated in the lane. However, in Australia, you're sitting on the right side of the car and driving on the left side of the road. So you need to use the right lane line as that meter instead. I often found my eyes looking for the left lane line, and my muscle memory would slowly drag me towards that side. However, you end up straddling 2 lanes as a result, the one you're driving in and the one to your left. This was especially true for days when I did longer driving sessions. By the time I did 3 or 4 hours, I'd get tired and my muscle memory would start to take over, and I'd end up drifting towards the left side. And I was wondering why I did this. And it's because your eyes have that muscle memory. So make sure to remind yourself to use the right lane line as your alignment for the car and where the car is on the road. Doing this also made me more comfortable early on, because I could rely on that to keep me positioned correctly on the road. Basically, keep my body close to the line, the right line, and we're good. It means you don't have to worry about the left side as much. That wraps up my tips for driving in Australia. Like I said before, I think these tips can also be used for Australians coming to America. However, be sure to flip the positions as necessary if you are. I think these tips can also generally apply to driving in other left-lane countries, like the UK or Japan. There are a few things, small things that are different, like using the metric system instead of the imperial, but I didn't find that these affected my driving too much. Stay to the posted speed sign and make sure your car is going that. Keep the numbers the same, basically. Make sure to respect the rules of the road as usual, and don't drive aggressively or negligently. And lastly, I recommend doing a bit of research on Australian-specific traffic laws. I know that Melbourne has an interesting turning system in the center of the city because of its trams. There's like a waiting area. I didn't do too much driving in downtown or the CBD in Melbourne as I did other places, so I'm not too experienced with this, but I know that there are some other YouTubers who have videos on that. Anyway, thanks so much for watching, and I hope you find these tips useful. Have a good trip.